This is the story of the turned shoes. Long ago, cities were built behind high walls for protection, and cities were built 1 to 2 days walking distance apart. Still, most people never traveled. They lived their entire lives behind the walls of the city where they were born. Most were happy with this. But there was one man who had grown very discontented. He was tired of walking along streets where he had played as a boy. He was tired of living in the same house he had lived in when he married. He had lived in that house so many years with his wife and his children. He began to feel that he could never be happy again unless he traveled to a new place and began a new life. And so the man said farewell to his wife and his children and walked out of the great gates of the city of his birth. He walked down the hill, along the road, onto the plains. He walked quickly because he was eager to find and begin living his new life. He walked over the hills and down into the valleys, on and on, until, as the sky grew rosy with the sunset, he came to a vast forest. Tall, dark trees. The road led through the forest, and so the man walked on. Among the dark, tall trees with their rough, thick trunks, he walked on and on until it became too dark to travel. Then he took the pack from his back and he spread out his sleeping mat. Then he had some bread and cheese and dried fruit that he had brought with him, and some water from the flask that he had carried. Now, he looked around and thought about what he had accomplished on this day. He had traveled all day long. It was a long day, but not a hard journey, and as everything was new to see, it was interesting to travel along. He had brought enough food and water for the journey. His shoes fit him well and did not hurt his feet. His legs were not tired. And now here he was in the midst of this great green cathedral. And he was not afraid, only eager to find and begin his new life, perhaps tomorrow. Before he laid down to sleep, he took off his shoes and set them beside him, pointing in the direction that he would travel the next day, so as not to be confused when he woke up in this strange new place. And then he laid down and went to sleep. He slept soundly all night long. He didn't even wake up when some curious forest elves peered at him. They noticed the shoes beside him and got an idea for a trick to play on the man. They picked up his shoes and turned them so that now they pointed in the direction from which he had come. And then, giggling to themselves, they disappeared back into the forest. The next morning, the man woke up refreshed and rested. He put his things back in his pack. He shouldered his pack. He stepped into his shoes and walked on in the direction that they were pointing. On and on he walked through the forest, following the road until it led out onto the plains. He walked on, walking quickly because he was eager to find and begin that new life. He walked on over the hills and through the valleys until, as the sky grew rosy with the sunset, he came to a hill on which stood a walled city that looked strangely familiar. But this is good, thought the man, for if my new place reminds me of my old place, I will feel more comfortable living here. And so he walked up the hill and stood in front of the great gates, which also seemed strangely familiar. He walked through the gates and on to the streets of the city, which looked just like the streets of his old city. He walked on until he came to a side street, which looked just like the street where he had lived with his family. He came to a house that looked just like the house that he had lived with his wife and his children. He knocked on the door, and when the door opened, he was surrounded by a loving wife and laughing children who welcomed him inside. And there he stayed, happy and prosperous for the rest of his life.